Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Gulnihal, and I'm an MSc student in counseling at Bangor University. I'm really excited to share my dissertation with you, titled Between Madness and Meaning, a systematic review of how mental health professionals navigate the diagnostic ambiguity between psychosis and mystical experience. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but bear with me, it's a topic I'm deeply passionate about. I'd like to begin by sharing a bit why I chose this topic. Growing up in Turkey, I was surrounded by a rich tapestry of spiritual and cultural traditions. As a child, I remember hearing the story of Halaj Mansur, a ninth century Sufi mystic who famously declared, "I am the truth," and was executed for what some saw as blasphemy, but others saw as profound spiritual insight. His story stuck with me. How could someone's experience can be so transformative for some, yet so misunderstood by others? As I grew older, I met people, friends, family, and later clients, who shared deeply personal, non ordinary experiences that didn't fit neatly into everyday life. And that's where the professional dilemma comes in. Imagine someone walks into your therapy room, grounded, articulate, and perhaps even flourishing in some areas of their life. They describe hearing a voice they believe is divine, receiving messages they feel are sacred. You're fully with them, holding their reality with respect and curiosity. But quietly, the clinical questions begin to surface. Is this spiritual emergence or spiritual emergency? Is this a breakthrough or a breakdown waiting to happen? Am I missing signs of risk? Do I refer for medical assessment? Do I sit with it? Do I name it? The stakes are high. If you overpathologize, you may strip away something sacred and meaningful. If you underassess, you may overlook emergent psychosis, putting the client at risk. These personal encounters and professional questions made me wonder, how do we make sense of this blurry, uncertain boundary? And that's the heart of my dissertation. It's not about finding the right label, it's about exploring how professionals navigate this ambiguity, what they actually do when faced with this tension. And that's what I'll be sharing with you today. Before I get into my research, I want to share two different views from Freud and Jung, two key figures in the early days of psychology. Freud was highly skeptical of spiritual experiences. He described them as a kind of collective illusion, a psychological defense against fear and helplessness. For Freud, these experiences weren't moments of insight or growth. These were symptoms rooted in childhood needs and wishful thinking. Jung, on the other hand, took a very different view. He saw mystical experiences as part of the psyche's natural process of healing and growth, something he called individuation, or the journey toward becoming whole. Jung believed that what we sometimes label as madness could actually be the psyche's attempt to reconnect with something deeper, whether we call that the unconscious, the soul, or the divine. So, even in psychology's early roots, we can already see the split. Is it illness or is it transformation? And that's exactly the kind of uncertainty that still shows up in therapy rooms today. So, what are we talking about when we say mystical experiences and psychosis? Mystical experiences, as defined by scholars like William James and Walter Stace, involve profound shifts in consciousness. Think feelings of timelessness, unity, sacredness, or encounters with the divine. They're not just religious, they can happen in nature, art, or moments of deep reflection. Psychosis, on the other hand, as per the DSM 5, involves disruptions in reality testing like hallucinations or delusions, often causing distress and impairment. Here's the tricky part: these two can look strikingly similar. Both might involve hearing voices, seeing visions, or feeling a heightened sense of meaning. Neurologically, they even share overlapping mechanisms, like changes in the brain's default mode network. So clinicians are left with this puzzle. How do we tell them apart? To explore this question, I carried out qualitative systematic review, following the PRISMA guidelines to make sure the process was clear, transparent, and rigorous from start to finish. Also use something called the CASP checklist, a tool designed to help researchers assess whether the studies they include are well designed, relevant, and trustworthy. I searched two major academic databases, PubMed and PsycINFO, for studies published from 1980 onwards. This period was when the mental health field started paying more attention to spirituality and its role in mental health care. My focus was on finding studies that looked at or gave insights into how mental health professionals navigate these experiences in practice. In total, I started with 299 papers. After going through a structured screening process, I narrowed this down to 28 studies that fully met my criteria. After that, I used narrative synthesis and thematic analysis, which basically means I looked across all these studies to see what themes kept coming up again and again. From this process, three key themes emerged: navigating diagnostic ambiguity, spiritual and cultural competence, and lastly, narrative meaning making and integrative practice. First, navigating diagnostic ambiguity. This theme is about the real challenges clinicians face when trying to make sense of whether an experience is spiritual or psychotic. Many studies highlight the usefulness of clinical tools like Lukov's criteria, the DSM-5's religious or spiritual problem code, and the concept of spiritual emergency introduced by Grove and Grove. What these frameworks have in common is that they tend to focus on the wider context of the experience, not just what the person is seeing or hearing, but how they are coping with it, how it's impacting their life, and whether it's connected to their cultural or spiritual background. One of the subthemes that helps to explain this difficulty is the concept of ego dissolution. Ego dissolution isn't a formal tool, but it appeared in several studies as a helpful way to understand why the boundary feels so blurry. It describes a loss of personal boundaries, a sense of merging with the universe, or losing the I as a separate self. In many spiritual traditions, this is seen as a sign of awakening, much like the story of the Halaj, seeing himself as one with the divine truth. Some researchers suggest that the timing of ego loss is important. When ego dissolution happens after someone has developed a stable sense of self, it may feel expansive and meaningful, a spiritual breakthrough. But when it happens before that stability is in place, it can lead to confusion and fragmentation, more like a breakdown. Second, spiritual competence and culturally competent care. This was a big one. One of the strongest themes in my review was the lack of spiritual and cultural competence among many mental health professionals. Several studies pointed out that clinicians often feel uncomfortable or unprepared when spiritual or religious content shows up in therapy. Some even tend to dismiss or pathologize these experiences too quickly without really taking the time to explore what they might mean for the client. For example, research with people living with bipolar disorder showed that many wished their mental health professionals had been more open and curious about the spiritual side of their experiences. This challenge becomes even more complex in cross cultural contexts. Clients from non Western or spiritually oriented backgrounds often express emotional pain through metaphor, bodily sensations, or symbolic language, rather than using typical psychological terms. And when clinicians aren't familiar with these ways of expressing distress, there's a risk of misinterpretation or misdiagnosis, leaving clients feeling unseen or misunderstood. Alongside this lack of training, the review also highlighted clinician bias as another major barrier. The way therapists make sense of spiritual content is shaped by their own training, personal beliefs, and worldview. And when a client's experience challenges those beliefs, there's a risk that the therapist might impose their own framework. One participant put it really powerfully when they said, "Many people don't realize how devastating it is to be told that that's not real. Because to the people, it is real, and it needs to be treated as if it's real." This really captures the emotional harm that can happen when clients feel invalidated or disrespected, especially when their experiences carry deep spiritual meaning for them. The review suggests that spiritual and cultural competence is not just an extra, but really a core part of ethical and holistic care. But it's not all negative. Some studies show that a more open and reflective approach is possible. For example, some mental health nurses, even without formal tools, use their cultural awareness, emotional sensitivity, and professional intuition to support clients. Overall, these studies suggest that humility, openness, and reflective practice may actually be more effective than rushing to put a label on these experiences. Finally, narrative meaning making and integrative practice. 19 studies highlighted the value of narrative and symbolic approaches, which help clients explore their experiences without forcing a single explanation. One paper introduced the idea of boundary objects, a concept that sees the experiences as existing in between, not fully clinical, not fully spiritual, but possibly both. This helps clients hold that uncertainty and focus on what the experience means to the client rather than needing to choose one label. This approach flips the script on how we think about unusual experiences. Instead of seeing them as something to get rid of or shut down, they are reframed as meaningful and sometimes even transformative. In fact, research shows that many people already have a sense that their experience might hold spiritual or personal meaning. What they often need is support to make sense of it in a way that feels safe and true to them. Some approaches take this even further by treating visions and voices as real and meaningful, using storytelling to help clients integrate these experiences into their lives. The results: fewer hospitalizations, fewer crises, and less suicidality. Now, it's not all rosy. Some research outside of my final dataset throw in a bit of reality check, pointing out that sometimes trying to make meaning out of psychotic experiences can backfire. It might reinforce unhelpful beliefs or lead to self blame. So it's definitely something we need to keep in mind. But on the other hand, other researchers push back on this fear of feeding the delusion. They suggest that engaging with these experiences, rather than avoiding it, can actually help build trust and open up insightful conversations. Another key piece of this theme is the integrative approach, looking at the whole person. This means paying attention to emotional, cognitive, somatic, cultural, and spiritual dimensions of clients. Spittles in 2020 talks about integrating the technologies of consciousness, like rituals, chanting, which can help people navigate intense states by giving them meaning, embodiment, and community. It's like creating a container for those big experiences so that they don't spiral into chaos. The body came up again and again in the studies. These experiences aren't just in the mind, they're often felt in the body. Clients describe things like surges of energy, feeling drained, or fearing touch, which sometimes made sense in their spiritual or cultural context, like spirit possession. One person even described their spiritual connection as something inside me, I can feel it. That really shows how the body can speak its own truth. Okay, here's where I got really excited: collaboration between clinicians and spiritual religious leaders. I wasn't expecting this, but it's such a game changer. Studies show that when mental health professionals team up with shamans, chaplains, or indigenous healers, clients get care that's more culturally resonant. It improves diagnostic accuracy and strengthens therapeutic relationships. It's like bridging two worlds to support the client better. One of the biggest takeaways for me is that we really need to widen our lens as mental health professionals. These kinds of experiences aren't just happening in someone's head, they're often deeply felt in the body and shaped by culture. Looking back on this theme of bodily sensations, it really made me think about what this could mean for the practice going forward. It seems that working with the body directly could be a valuable next step. And this is where approaches like sensory motor psychotherapy or somatic experiencing might really help. These methods give us practical ways to help clients feel safer in their bodies while still respecting the meaning they give to their experiences. And circling back to that collaboration with spiritual leaders, this really caught my attention. It's such a promising idea, but it's not without challenges. What happens if a spiritual leader and a clinician disagree about what's going on? Or if the confidentiality becomes unclear? One thing that might help is having clear protocols in place, like open communications, getting clear consent from the client, and having structured supervision to keep everyone on the same page. This could make sense to partnerships safer and more effective, while still honoring both clinical and cultural perspectives. But here's what really stayed with me. Sometimes the most meaningful thing we can do is to sit with the uncertainty. Gadamer talks about therapy as a dialogue, where two perspectives meet and something new emerges, something neither person could fully predict or control. And Stacy's complexity theory reminds us that human experiences, especially altered states, are messy, unpredictable, and constantly shifting. So we can lean into that messiness with empathy and curiosity, trusting that meaning will unfold over time. So, what does this all mean? I believe it calls us to build somatic awareness, cultural humility, and relational openness so we can walk alongside clients as they navigate that blurry space between psychosis and spiritual experience, turning therapy into a shared process of meaning making and healing. No review is perfect. This study, conducted by a single researcher, risks selection and interpretive bias without a second reviewer. Many included studies lacked transparency in researcher reflexivity, sampling, and ethical considerations, reducing trustworthiness. Another thing is limiting sources to English language. Peer reviewed papers may have excluded non Western or indigenous perspectives, introducing a Western centric bias. Including theoretical and narrative papers added depth, but complicated firm clinical conclusions due to diverse study types and limited primary data. So, future studies should adopt inclusive, robust methodologies, incorporating non English and grey literature, particularly from indigenous and non Western cultures. Co designed research with communities, mixed methods, and longitudinal cross cultural studies could enhance diagnostic frameworks. Intersectional approaches and clinician training in spiritual and cultural competence are critical to bridge theory and practice. So, in the end, this review isn't about finding clear answers, it's about shifting from labeling to truly listening. Supporting clients through these experiences takes more than clinical tools. It takes curiosity, humility, and the courage to stay with what's unclear. If we can do that, we can offer care that honors both mystery and meaning. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts or any questions you might have.